Steve Carey is a legend in Australian journalism and one of Australia's most experienced TV news and public affairs executive. Now, during Steve's 35 years in the media, he's been an ABC News presenter, a foreign correspondent, Chief of Staff on the Sydney 2000 Olympics, the supervising producer of Today Tonight, and a director for Channel 7 News. And he now runs the highly successful media training and public affairs consultancy, Newsflash Media. Now, Steve joins us regularly on The Informer, and he's here today to discuss all things government and media. Welcome, Steve.
G'day, how you going?
Now, all of those years' experience in the media, Steve, have you ever seen mainstream media's reputation suffering as it is now?
That's a good question, and I guess the short answer is no. And I think there are many reasons for that. I think the main reason is that our trust with mainstream media is very low, and that follows on from the Trump era with the slogan, fake news, which was picked up everywhere and bandied around. And the trouble is there are a lot of keyboard warriors these days. They think they can be journalists, they think they have a say, and they do have a say, but not everybody's say is equal to everybody else's. So, for example, when we're doing journalism, when we're talking about journalism, you're talking about people that have done years and years and years of investigations, work, credible bodies of work to investigate stories, interview people, learn the tools of the trade, and they actually have a code of ethics, believe it or not, that still exists. So you get a lot of people who are very skeptical of the news because they don't like what they hear, or they hear counter things on, particularly Twitter, or Twitter is the worst probably, or Facebook. So they form their own opinion that the news that they hear doesn't resonate with them, so they don't want to hear it.
Now, it's funny, isn't it, with Twitter? It's only about 13% of the Australian population that actually use Twitter. And is it the echo chamber effect that leads them to think that they're so influential, or are they actually influential?
Oh, I think, look, there's no doubt they're influential, but it carries an unfair weighting, in my view. I mean, Twitter it's the old saying that you and my parents would have said, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And in this case, back in the day, I liken it, a lot of people probably won't want to hear this, but back in the day, there was one village idiot screaming from the middle of the village. Now you've got a lot of people, I'm not saying they're idiots, but I am saying that there are people who potentially have more of a voice than they would have in the past. And those people tend to congregate on social media. So what you said earlier is exactly right. It creates this echo chamber effect, whereas if I say it and somebody else picks it up over here and then somebody else amplifies it, all of a sudden what becomes non-fact becomes quickly fact, because nobody's able to counter it. And there's this weight of opinion that sort of gets a tidal wave of support from people who may not be as well informed as the experts. And the reason I say that is, we've got peer-reviewed medical research that goes through a series of peer-reviewed reports and tests and checks and balances. Now, some of the researchers that are putting that stuff out, they've dedicated their whole lives to that one area of research. But all of a sudden, I can be online at midnight and I find something which hasn't been found by the entire medical community, but all of a sudden that's fact. And the trouble is there are a lot of people that are willing to go with the hyperbole rather than the facts, and the facts still count. And that's the only thing, in my view, that really matters in the whole debate is, where do you get your facts? How credible is the source? Can you trust what you're hearing and where you're hearing it from?
Not to mention, Steve, the scientific method actually leads where they're trying to disprove what puts up, not reinforce. So somebody makes a finding, makes a claim, and they try to repeat it, or they try to actually see where the faults lie. And if they can't, it's not that it's been proved, it hasn't been disproved, so it stands. Whereas with the way the algorithms work, you click on one link, whatever it be, you're directed to other links that just give you more information that reinforces the point that you first saw in the first paper. And that leads to this,
exactly right.
This moral certainty.
Right. It's the trouble with social media, or the trouble with people who are unwilling to listen. I don't have a problem with somebody debating with me. I'm open-minded enough to be persuaded by a really good argument which is factually based, and which then I can go away and double check myself. But I force myself to look at a whole range of media. So I just don't go down the a course of ever diminishing return. And that's what social media can do. Sometimes it's a channel of ever diminishing return. And by that, I mean, to your point about algorithms, I don't like something, I'll follow that. The algorithm picks it up. It reinforces that I'm right, even if I'm not, and the facts are dead against me. But I'll keep going down that rabbit hole to the point where I can't be persuaded. And the trouble at the moment that I see is that a lot of people are falling or going down that rabbit hole. And social media has amplified that. So they find like-minded people, even if it's the minority, they find like-minded people who are going to encourage them to say, yeah, you're right. And we all want to be right. Like, nobody wants to be told, hey, you're a dope and you've got it totally wrong. But the trouble with social media is it massages that egotistical side of us, which says, I can't be wrong. And if I'm not wrong, I can't possibly listen to what's right. And therein lies the problem that we've lost with a lot of the social media and distrust of mainstream. We've lost the ability to listen. And we've lost the ability, I think, a lot of the time to be persuaded by argument that is actually factually based. And when we lose that, we then lose the ability to have rational thought, which is going to be the best for everybody.
Now, Steve, I follow your advice and consume my media from a wide range, and the disparity that we see is almost Orwellian. With the local recent protests in Victoria, we see some media estimating the crowd in the hundreds, and we see others estimating them in close to 1 million. And neither is true, but it's the old Orwellian, don't believe what your eyes. Why is the media bought into this narrative where we have to go that far to the extreme? That's where I think a lot of the lack of credibility and people switching off has come from.
Look, I think there's some truth in that. There's more than a grain of truth in that. And as a young reporter, it was always very difficult to gauge how many people were at a big protest. I mean, I covered way back in the day during the Joe Bjelke-Petersen days, the CQEB, Southeast Queensland Electricity Board protests, and they were massive. But you couldn't tell. So my rules, my yardstick, I would talk to the cops. I mean, the police are there to give a crowd estimate. If it comes from another source, it's not just me. If I say police estimate the crowd, then that's what I'll go with. If my eyes are telling me something obviously wrong, then why even put an estimate on it? You know, why even put an estimate on it? If you're working in television, show the pictures. The pictures tell the story. People can decide if there's a crowd of people snaking from Parliament House all the way down to Little Burke Street to the mall, and they're sort of 30 or 40 thick across the street, you can tell it's more than a few hundred people. But look, I think the difficulty we get into is, yes, there are a lot of people protesting, but common sense dictates that if more than 90% of the population are vaccinated, then the people who are protesting, even though I support their right to protest, it tells you that they are in the minority, doesn't it? Because if most of us are vaccinated, those that aren't, common sense would tell you that, well, that's the minority. Now, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong in their beliefs, because what they believe is their belief. So if somebody says to me, I believe in X, and that's the way it's going to be, then that's what I have to accept. But the difficulty, as I keep saying, is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I keep telling myself I'm right, how can I be wrong?
Now, with your years of experience and your obviously influence in advising people in government, how does the opposition go about getting some traction with the Andrews, do you think? What would your advice be if we're going to get some free advice from Steve Carey? Why don't they seem to be able to land anything given the...
That'll never happen.
But, and as a journalist, how do you see, just recently, I think it was the Victorian Information Officer, Sven Blumel, saying that the FOI needs a complete overhaul. Andrew's fighting tooth and nail to stop the release of any documentation or information regarding the information that led to lockdowns. How do you go about actually reporting when it's hard to get anything on the government?
Look, it's a two-barrel question, so I'll answer part one. What would my advice be to the opposition? Opposition is difficult because even though you can say whatever, you don't make policy. You can say you're going to do something, but until you get into government, we don't know whether you're going to do it or not. I think the mistake a lot of oppositions fall into is that they're always negative. Always. The government, they can never admit if the government does get something right. And I think as a person who sits sort of middle of the road, I want a little bit of a collegiate view sometimes. I expect you to take a converse view because you are the opposition, that's your job. But I think when all you get is negativity every single step of the way, it becomes white noise, you know, blah, 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 blah. Well, I switch off. So what I'd be saying is be very careful about where and when you have a go at the government. I mean, it's the obvious place to sit at the moment, despite the Premier saying yesterday, you know, a couple of days ago, that we've done an outstanding job. I mean, I don't necessarily take that view. I think if you look back at how many people have died in Victoria, how many lockdowns, how many businesses have gone out of business, you would say that it's a nonsense to me to say that it's been outstanding. So I think they've done as good a job as they think they could do. Could they have done better? Absolutely. I mean, we can always do better in hindsight. So the opposition needs to pick its targets and look carefully at what I call the sweet spot of policy where people expect them to be doing some work, i.e. Health, crime, traffic, rebuilding business, so the economy, that kind of stuff. On your other question, you know, I sort of think that where we sit at the moment, we're all in a state of flux anyway. So, you know, where we're going to go for the rest of the year, who knows? Who knows what we're going to do? It's hard to advise on the second part, but the first part, the opposition's really got to look at where it's going and look at those policy issues, I think.
Now, in all those years in media, Steve, the division that's in Australia, when we look back pre-pandemic, the bushfires, the farmers, the droughts, we all came together. How do we get back? Who's on the horizon that will go, you know what, I'm not about the base, I'm not about the left, I'm not about the right, I'm about Australia. How long do you think the pendulum's going to keep swinging? Is there someone that can unite us?
That's a great question. I wish I had the answer, because you look at Omicron at the moment coming through. I mean, the news today, we're talking today, whenever this is broadcast, but, you know, the UK looking at bringing back restrictions, people working from home. Who would have thought? I mean, who would have thought that we're coming into, you know, another Christmas, and in the overseas, they're looking at more severe restrictions. And we know from experience that if they do it overseas, I'm not saying it will happen, but the likelihood is that there's a temptation for state premiers to go, you know what, if it's good enough for the UK to lock people back down again and make them work from home, maybe we should. So I think you're exactly right. Where I think there has been a bit of a dropped ball in all this is that I would have loved to have seen the federal government step up earlier, like a year and a bit ago, and say, we are a federation. The whole notion of a federation is we work together. The reason we have a federation is that I have the right, or I should have had the right, to travel in Australia wherever I want to, when I want to. That's changed. And we all know the history of that. And it's simplistic to say, I think, as a lot of commentators do, that the premiers have had a rush of blood and they're, you know, drunk on power. There might be a tiny bit of that, but, you know, at the end of the day, they're still people. They're trying to work for their constituents. They are political animals, so they'll read the room. They can see that voters in states that have had severe lockdowns, like Western Australia, Queensland, the premiers were returned to power after the elections. You look at the recent stats here and it says the Andrews government is actually better or liked more, which I find extraordinary. But I think your question really cuts the heart of where we are as a nation. How long is it going to take to get back? I don't know. You know, and I think that's one of the perplexing things about this whole pandemic, is that it's shown the cracks within our political, geopolitical system, is that I haven't been back to Queensland for 2 years to see my mum, because every time I've wanted to go, there's been a lockdown. Secondly, I don't want to risk going across a border and then find, I'm going to be shut down for 2 weeks. So it's a great question. And I think really we need some solid leadership at a federal level to bring people together and say, hey, enough's enough. We've got this vaccination rate. We're up to this level. Let's now calm it down again and allow people to travel freely. I do think people want to travel. I really do. Interstate, I know I do.
All right, let's wind it up there, because when Steve Carey says I've asked a brilliant question, I'm going to take that as a win for the day. Thanks so much for your time, Steve, and look forward to speaking to you again.
See you, mate.